Hello, welcome to The Exhausted Programmer. My name is Alexander, and today we're taking a first look into Django. This video is the first in a short list of videos about Django, but in a much longer project for this channel, something that I expect to take up the better part of the rest of this year, where we look at a bunch of different full stack options for software. Most of them are going to have a very similar layout in the sense that there's going to be a backend database connection layer. So the backend can be adjustable to use any number of them, and the front end will usually be a browser. But the middle layer, the thing that handles the connection between the two. We've kind of looked at this in a previous video with React and making our own full stack using a file and some awk script. But this series is to look at something that you might actually see in a professional setting, and for us to try to determine maybe pros and cons of using different systems, as well as finding ways of comparing the output of these different systems. How easy are they to develop, but also how fast can they process the data? Because for some people, one of those is more important than the other, but not for everybody. Making these videos is going to take a lot of work on my part. I need to context switch. So for one video, I'll be writing in JavaScript, another Python. I also plan on looking at Java and maybe even trying to make my own in C. That's a stretch goal that I might get to. Not that these in themselves is hard to do, but the context switching, as well as all the other things going on in my life that isn't this YouTube channel. I know that all I talk about is YouTube and making these videos on this channel because I like to keep everything kind of separated, but I can't pretend like this is all that I do. So I'll be making these videos as fast as I can, as well as I can, as thorough as I can. But if I got to spend time setting up the development cycle, I might as well make a video of it. And so in this video, I'm going to take advantage of that idea and show you how I set up a very basic Django app stack. Now, if you are really concerned about setting up your own Django app, the best place to start with is just looking at Django's own documentation. That's where I got a lot of the ideas for this video. I've gone a little bit further because I have certain goals that I try to reach whenever I set up my own development systems. One I've mentioned before, and I'll mention again, is that I don't want to have my app ran locally and accessed locally. I want to be able to run the code on a server and access it from a client. So I am going to go through an extra hurdle of making sure that I can access this Django app that's running on one machine and see it from really any other machine on my local network. Other goals that I have is to make sure that people can see at least things happening. A big problem with documentation is trying to make it verbose, but not being too overburdened. We've come across documentation that uses way too many words to describe what's going on and others that don't use enough. I am not the maintainer of Django, so I don't really have to find that perfect balance. Instead, all I have to do is make a video that shows what's happening. And so it's a much simpler goal for me to attain. And maybe, just maybe, if you're hitting problems setting up your own Django app, this video might be helpful to debug some of those things. As always, there will be a link in the description to all the code I run, plus some of the files that we edit. I won't have the entire Django app there, but most of this stuff is going to be created by automated scripts anyway, so you can just follow along and just copy and paste over the files from my repository into your directory to get to where I'm at, or you can try typing it out yourself, whatever is best for you. As far as prerequisites for this video, I would say that you should at least know how to program something, maybe Python, maybe not, and that you know how to look up documentation for anything I'm using. If I'm using something and I'm not being very clear on what it does, do not forget there are man pages that exist. So if you are seeing me use something, I'll use ln later. You can type in man ln to get more information, including what certain flags mean. I'll be using the -s flag for that command specifically, so you can see that this makes a symbolic link instead of a hard link. What does that mean? Well, Google's your friend, but it's just a shortcut if you're from Windows. And since we are looking at setting up a website of sorts, there will be some white background, which contrasts heavily with this black background. I didn't bother to try to make sure that that didn't happen for this video. So if you're in a place where having the flash of white and flash of black isn't good, just a heads up that that will happen in this video. The first thing is you need to have all the right things installed. For this, I think this is all I had to install. Python 3, which was already installed, Python 3 pipe, which actually, odd enough, wasn't, this virtual environment package, and SQLite. I got all this from the repository of this version of Linux meant whatever modern Ubuntu distro or long-term release version of Ubuntu, I should say. You should be pretty good to just run this. I've already have, so it's not gonna do anything for me. So I'll just Control-C out of this to save some time. Another thing you might wanna do is for some operating systems, when you go to run Python after you've installed Python 3, this will not work. It actually will for me because I've already made a fix for this, but for you, if running Python does not bring up the Python 3 shell, if it brings up the Python 2 shell or just doesn't run, there's a simple thing that we can do is create an alias for Python that tells it to replace it wherever we use Python with Python 3. Like I said, this is already defined for me. So let me see if I can show you a better example. In my little test directory here, I created a music directory. In there, I just created a bunch of fake songs. They're all empty 0-byte files. There's nothing really there, but you know, I might want to ls music from time to time. And a way I can do that and make it shorter for me is I can alias lm to equal ls and then test music. And when I do this, then no matter where I'm at, if I type in lm, it'll show me what's in my music directory. Again, I can do it in this directory. Does the same thing because the alias, if you do it in your bash, whenever you reset, it will go away. If you want it to stick in your home directory, there should be a bash rc. Somewhere in here, there'll be an alias section. And then for me, what I did is I just went down here and alias python equals python 3. You do that, you do have to reset your bash session, so you can just log out and log back in, or run reset might work it. I should have tested that. But whatever the case is now whenever I type in Python, it should bring up Python 3. Is it, where is Python? Okay, so that didn't work there. But as I showed, when I run Python, I get Python version 3. So the first thing we want to do is create a directory for our work. I know I'm in a test directory already, but I wouldn't do this. I don't know, just whatever. You make the directory, you cd into the directory, and once you're in the directory, you can start running commands. So Python, and this works again because Python is Python 3 for me. That is something to be aware. If you're doing this yourself to make sure it matches, if you don't want to do alias, just make sure you're doing Python 3. When we do this, we set up a virtual environment. I guess I could have showed you that there's nothing in the Django directory, but I did just create it. And so there was nothing there before. And now there's this directory. And we can take a look in this directory. But if we, look, there's a lot of stuff in there. Because remember, nothing else exists except for what we just created with this little command. And what the next step in the instructions will tell you to do is to source your my.env, that directory we just created. In there, there's a bin directory. And there is a bash script called activate. It is a bash script. And when we do that, we have something that shows us that we've had some change. If you're really concerned about your prompt, you can change what shows up in that bash script. So if we go in here and look at activate, here we have definition of a variable, not a variable, a function, which is how you get out. And I'll show that in a second. But how you get out of this virtual environment. And then, there's a bunch of logic here. It's really not too hard to follow along if you read it yourself. But we see here that our PS1 prompt gets this, and then the prompt is put right back in. And I think that's where it's set. I actually haven't tested out if you change it here, if it'll change it there. But whatever the case is, a good way of knowing you're in the virtual environment is this. And again, we can run that function deactivate to get out of it. I guess if I was more professional at this, I would explain what the virtual environment did before I used it, but now's as good time as any. What it allows you to do is to sort of have your own versions of Python packages for this project. So if you're maintaining multiple projects and some of them rely on very specific version numbers of certain packages, you're running a Python 3.2 and the newest version of a package only works with version 3.10 and above. You can set things in requirement files that we're not going to look at today, but it is something that's really helpful for that. There is a reason why we are using it for this project, and I'll explain that in a little bit, but let's go ahead and make the virtual environment a little bit easier to use. First, it's worth pointing out that you don't have to type in source. You can actually just do a dot. This is actually a pretty common thing to do in bash scripts. I have bash scripts that help me make some of these videos, and this is how I sort of import libraries. So I create a little library as a bash script, and then I can just run dot and then that library, and it sort of does the same thing as the source because it's a very common way of getting things done. What both of these are doing is they're basically just running every line of that script straight through. Again, let's deactivate this because we want to do one more thing to make this a little bit easier to use, and that is using that ln command I mentioned before. This will be a symbolic link, sort of like a shortcut. And what we need to do is to provide it the source and the location, the destination, activate if I can spell. And now if we look in our directory here, we have this activate file that is a different color than what we've seen so far. And if we do lsla, we can see that it is an L instead of a directory, or let's say if we had like a text file, text.txt, which then doesn't have anything written there, but it's an L for a link, and it even tells us where it's pointing to in a relative way, which is how I defined it. Just, you know, if you ever see something, ls can be very helpful for figuring out stuff about stuff if you don't know where to start. And here we see that it is a link. Of course, we don't need that text file, so let's just go ahead and get rid of it and show now, instead of running source and then the whole thing, we can just run dot activate, and of course tab completion makes it even faster, and we're in that same thing. Why do we want to do this? Well, it's because when I installed all those other things at the very beginning of this video, the stuff from the repository, I also installed Django. And if we get out of here and we do Django admin version, we see that it is version 4.2.11. Now, is this really going to be a problem? Well, I don't know, but I'm not here to fully optimize and figure out every little detail about every single stack that I'm looking into. All I can tell you is that there is a version of Django out that I can get access to, version 5.1.5, and since it's a whole major number revision difference, it's probably worth going for it. I did do some searching and I got the standard boilerplate of improved code and efficiency and more functionality, but I didn't go in to figure out what all that really meant. So how do you get a newer version of something when the repository of your operating system doesn't have it? Well, it depends on what it is. There's GitHub repositories, there's package managers of all sorts, and a package manager is exactly what we're going to use for this. Again, we get into this virtual environment and we use the Python package manager just to show that this is version 24.0. We can use this to install Django. And when we do this, it's going to take it a second. And when it's done, we can run the Django admin version again. And now it's 5.1.5. And it is just as simple as being in that virtual environment. We get out of it, we're back to 4.2. We go back into it and 5.1.5. Do note that if I create a new directory, create a new virtual environment, that pip will not know that Django is installed. In fact, if I wouldn't have done the pip install Django and try to use Django, I would get errors saying Django isn't installed because the virtual environment doesn't know it's installed. It might be problematic for new users getting into it and like, wait, I thought I installed this, and then you figured out that you installed it in the wrong context. But once you have a package and a whole app set up and all the packages defined and all the version numbers defined, this virtual environment just makes things so much easier, and it takes out so much of the thought process that you might not even understand what's happening if you didn't set it up yourself. So we set it up ourselves, so hopefully we know what's happening. Now, version numbers are very important. The further you get away from a good programming language like C, even C++, different versions can lead to different results in running the same code, which is one of the reasons why I'm not 100% behind C++. But Python is even worse. JavaScript's even worse than Python. So it's important to know what versions we're using for stuff. So we already saw pips 24, Django 5.1, Python 3.12, and SQLite, which I don't follow its development at all, version 3.45.1, and some really long hex or value, a 64-bit value, which I hope is not some sort of private key, because if it is, well, it's no longer private. Anyway, we need to start the project, and this is something that's a little bit different in the documentation. It creates a whole new directory, but I'm already in a Django directory, and I didn't want a Django directory with the Django directory inside of it. And if you don't provide it a directory install, it'll create a directory called my site. So my site inside of my site, it's whatever. If you do it this way, it'll just create the my site directory in this directory here. So if we take a look into my sites, we'll see some files which are very familiar to me, maybe not familiar to you. We will be looking at just a few of these settings, URLs, and then one called views These are your 3 of the 4 most basic files you'll see. Also models.py we'll see later. These are just very common things you see throughout Django. So just get used to them. Now here is another difference between me and the documentation is again because of my own set standard of making sure things can run across the network, the local network, not the internet, because I'm not going to put my network exposed like that. The instructions say to run Python manage.py run server. And when we do this, we do see some red text, but this red text is not bad for us right now. And in fact, it's not bad for us at all, but we will fix that later. But it tells us right here that we need to go to this address to access it. And if we were on this machine, then this would work, but I am not on this machine. And hopefully I don't need to show you that going to 127.0.0.1 is not going to work. Instead, I know that the computer is going to be here and then 8,000. And when I run this, well, we're just going to not get anything. And that's fine. This is a Firefox bug though. I want to show off that Firefox is telling me this is not working because, well, our first step is to make it not Firefox tell us it's not working. Now, in previous videos, one of the things I did want to say is that some of these programs, a lot of these programs are actually pretty helpful all on their own. You don't always need someone to solve these problems for you. I know a lot of people like to go to Stack Overflow and try to Google their problem and copy and paste the solution. But sometimes it's just really easy to just ask for help directly. And when we do this, we actually see some information here. It is a bit zoomed in, but I think this is all of it. Start a lightweight web server for development and also serve static files. Positional arguments, address port, where you can give it a port number or an IP address and a port number. Now, me personally, in my own home, I have every device that connects to my router a assigned IP address so that I always know where every computer is. Plus, I do them in ranges, so all the cell phones are in the same 10 range, and then all the tablets are in the same 10 range, and all of the Raspberry Pis are in the same 10 range, etc. Why do I do that? Honestly, at this point, I don't know, but it is very helpful for things like this, where I always know that this Linux Mint computer that I'm running is at address 132 versus a Raspberry Pi that handles my podcast is always at IP address 108, and a different Raspberry Pi that handles an LED strip that I use for lighting is at address 109. Just things that make it pretty easy to memorize this stuff. At this point, we could sort of guess at exactly the format it's looking for here, but it does say it's positional argument, and that just means it comes next. If there was multiple positional arguments, then we'd have to do it in the right position or figure out exactly what that means for the exact programming language we're using because that changes. But I know this is what I want to run. If for some reason you do not know your IP address, you can always run IP adder. There are other things, ifconfig and things that you can find old information about, but this is the one I use. And here we see my address. So we have Ethernet ports, we have wireless ports. I only have one of each. And this low, which I think is just some sort of, loop back. And we also see that, like this one's down, this one up. It tells us a lot of stuff, but the thing that we're really looking for is this IP4 address. There is a 6, but I'm still not doing that in my own personal use, and I don't really want to because that's a lot more to type. But again, we can set this up using that IP address that I know, but also you can easily look up and the port number. And I'm using this because that's just the default one it used when it ran the run server and it didn't cause problems. So I'm going to keep using that, but you can adjust this. The documentation on Django's own website even talks about how some ports require sudo user if it's a low port. So you can really do a lot of cool stuff with this, have multiple of these running on the same machine and, whatever. But, we're going to run this. And again, we see the same red text, but we're not trying to solve that problem. Instead, we're trying to access the site. So if we go to our browser and we say, hey, let's try this, it's a different error message. And this error message comes from Django. It's a very particular format. I am going to zoom out because you're most likely to see it this way. You get stack traces that you can look into, local variables, all this kind of stuff shows you the code. It's actually very helpful. A lot of information, makes debugging a lot easier. A big selling point of using Django, but really we just stop right here at this first line, allowed hosts. You can also go back to the command line and see that this is using settings in mysite.settings. We combine those two things to solve this problem. So we need to find the variable allowed hosts, and the suggestion is to look at my settings my site dot settings, which really means actually my site and then settings.py. And when we come here, we'll actually see that there's this security warning here, you know, don't show this key off to anyone. Oh no. And allowed hosts right here. I've seen some documentation that says you can do this in a few different ways. What I know works is I can just say, allow this for the connection here. Again, you can do more than just one. This is clearly a Python list because we're in Python, and this is how you do lists. If you don't know what that means, it's mostly like an array in other languages. There's always some caveats. Don't need to get into that for this. And now once we have this, we can run the same command. And when we go to our site, we should see it working. I'm going to go ahead and zoom into the 300% like normal, and we get this. And ta-da, it's looking pretty good. Also, later on, when I was doing this, this page wouldn't show up anymore, and I honestly didn't know why. But right here it tells us debug is set to true, and I know where that's set, again in settings. And I have not configured any URLs at this point, which is true, and we will later. And part of me was wondering why this shows up and then it didn't show up. And it's because once you have it configured, then whatever. We'll get to that in a second. Now I'm using tmux to help with readability on my videos to block the very bottom bar so that the YouTube player doesn't get in the way. But this is actually a great place to use Django. I'm sorry, to use tmux, because you can keep the run server on this tab and then open up a new page and do all your edits here. But I'm going to keep it to 1 because that's sort of how I practiced it before I made this video. What we have created so far is a project, and a project can contain a lot of things, but for the sake of this video, multiple apps. We're just going to create one app. We're going to use that same manage.py file to help us get the right command going. You can easily look into the manage.py file and, you know, dig into it. I've had to do that for real work before, and you can see it like going through libraries and whatever. But for this video, we don't need to do that. We can do this, and we're going to create an app for polling. Now, we're not going to go all the way to create a whole polling app in this video. We're just going to look at some of the basic behind the scenes of what's happening when we create this stuff. Once we do this, now we have a directory polls. So our environment creation created this, creating the project created the my site. This is the app. The database was created also with, you know, the creation of this project, and we'll take a look at the database in a second. Of course, we created this. So, you know, we're seeing how all this stuff is building up, but we do have this polls directory. If we look into it, we see again, well, we don't see the URLs, but we see models and views, two things I did point out previously, and things that we're going to be editing in a little bit. Let's start with the views. If we go into views here, oh, yeah, that's right, we're views. It says to create your views here, and we can do that pretty easily. I'll just go ahead and type that and come back. If you're not that familiar with Python, from this library, we will import only this function. If we wanted the whole library, we could just import this library. And this is used here. And we're going to return a string. In the instructions, it's just a string. I decided to put some HTML in there to show that HTML is readable even at this point. If you wanted to be very basic with your views, you could just hard code HTML right here. And there are ways of having this break across lines so it doesn't just go on forever to the right. We don't need to worry about that, but it does work. We'll see that in just a second, but we also need to edit one more file. And by edit, I mean actually create the urls.py. It did exist in the my site. It does not exist yet in this app, but we're going to go ahead and create it. And when we come in here, we can just, you know, add in some lines. I already have it written somewhere else. I'm just going to paste it in to help reduce typos. And here we go, a URL pattern that says, hey, when we come here and we don't get anything, then we want to give it the views.index, name index. And if we go back into our views, that's what this is referring to. Yes, we could have different views here defined. There's other ways of defining different page layouts based on the URL. We're not going to cover it in this video at all. And now if we go back to our site, it shouldn't do anything because we actually haven't told the my site that anything's different. But we do have a problem, and that's because I have not ran the server again. Again, if you're running this all in tmux session and doing it in a smart way, it would be running constantly. So let's go back here, let's reload, and again, nothing changes here. That's because we're still at this level. If we try to go to, not dot, but slash, it doesn't work. And again, because my site URL. So again, error messages are pretty helpful here. So let's go ahead and fix that by doing my site and URLs. And we need to make a change here. And that change is pretty simple. We just need to add one more path here. So I typed in this into the URL, and then it's going to go to polls.url. And then in polls.url, we see that if nothing else is provided after that, it will give it that default index view that we defined. So now if I refresh this, because I forgot to import the include. So let's do that real quick. I tend not to like to do this stuff live, but here we are. So it comes from the Django URLs, and I like to put it alphabetical order when I can remember to do so. Now we can run the server. That works. Now we can come here and refresh. And hey, look, there's our phrase that we wrote in. We can also see the word world is bolded, as the HTML we wrote had the B flags before and after to tell it to make that bold. As I mentioned earlier, I had a problem because once we did this didn't work anymore. And it tells us, quite frankly, it's because we actually do have pages defined, polls and admin. And so no longer is it going to give us that default page. Of course, the admin page was defined already. I don't know why that didn't trigger it. Well, there's probably some logic that says admin doesn't count. But whatever the case, our polls page is working. Now, a huge key part of the whole Django setup is that instead of working with your database by setting up SQL queries like you would do, well, I don't know if you do it in modern PHP, but I've written a lot of PHP that uses straight up SQL queries, because SQL injections can't happen unless you give an opportunity for it to happen. And what is PHP other than SQL injections? But with Django, it's all handled by models. And those are handled in models file. So in polls, there already exists a file called models.py, and it even tells us where we create our models. We will be using this import models, and all models follow a simple layout. There is a lot of options you can do with inheritance and all that kind of stuff, but the most basic is that in that models that we imported, there is a model, and inside of here, we can create the objects sort of attributes, or if you're thinking of structs, the things inside of a struct, or whatever your background is. And with it, we're going to say that the question text will equal a character field that is also defined in that models that we imported above. And it has some settings that we can set with keyword pairings. So max length equals 200. So your question text cannot be more than 200 characters. What would happen if it was? I don't really know at this point. And if it's not acting like you would expect it to, you can redefine, I'm sure, how it will handle it. And then we also have a date time field that we're going to call pub date, but then date published is how it's going to be known in the data itself. And then there's also another class as part of the setup that I'm just going to copy and paste into here so that we can just continue on. And here we go. We see a different choice where we can, again, in my head, the way I think of these is as SQL tables. So there's a table called choice with columns called question, choice text, and votes. And then they are defined in such a way. Before we go any further into the polls app and database setup and all that, let's take a look at this red text here. If it's not visible, it says you have 18 unapplied migrations, and we're about to get all up into migrations. But I kind of want to explain what this is before we add our polls migrations to the mix. So how do you fix this migration problem? Well, the Python manage.py migrate, it tells you right here what to run. We run it. It does a lot of text to the screen. We could go through and read it, and some of these things will actually make a lot more sense in just a second. But now if we run the run server, no more red text. Simple as that to get rid of. Where are these migrations from? Because like I said, we're going to make it for the polls app that we just did. Well, if we go into our My Site and settings, we will see that we have a list of installed apps. And admin was one of the ones on a lot of those. I think we saw auth come through. Anyway, the migrations come from these installed apps. And we do want to make sure our app is an installed app. So we can do that by just adding one more thing here. If you're not familiar with the idea of the ever trailing comma, such as in this last line here, this is really great for version controls, because if I added something afterwards, If the comma wasn't here, I'd have to add it here and add the next line, and that would look like I changed or contributed these 2 lines by having the comma always there. It's not an issue. In fact, I could go and clean this up a little bit by doing the same thing, putting a comma after it, whatever. It's a great thing that Python allows you to do. Not every programming language allows you to do it. That's why I wanted to mention it here. So according to our settings, we have the installed app of polls there, but we need to tell Django to do a little bit more work here. So I'm going to get this command here, and we're going to use the manage.py to make the migrations for the polling app. And it's actually going to look at our models.py to realize that we created a model for question, created a model for choice, and it created this migrations file that we can take a look at. There is a directory called migrations, and in here will be every migration created. We only have 1, but we see up here there was 12 for the auth app. And when we come in here, we see some Python information, which takes our models and basically defines them a little bit better. It also creates these ID things that we didn't create, but if you've worked with a lot of data, having a default ID field that is auto-created and increments every creation, whatever, it's great. But that's the file that's created for the migrations, making it possible to build up the database exactly as it is in development, no matter where you're starting. So, you've had this program going on for like 10 years and you need to set up a new database. Well, you can run all the migrations to create the database, not the data, but the database schema, so that it matches wherever it's supposed to be in that development history. Now, in a second, we're going to run that same migrate command, but before we do, we can actually see what will be executed when we run the migrations by, again, with the manage.py, looking at the SQL migrate, our app, and the 0001, which is, the same as that right there. It's not a coincidence. And what we'll see is that it will create tables with the names, and then it'll create the columns with these things set, like auto increment for the ID. This stuff is set up for us in this command, or at least it'll show us what will be ran. And then when we run the migrate, then this will be executed into our SQL database, and then we'll take a look at that right after. Actually, not right after. I'm going to do one more thing before we get there. But here we go. We run the migrate like we did before. We see similar output as before. There's only one thing to migrate now because all the others have already been migrated in, and we're good. There are 2 more tools that I want to point out with Django that is very helpful for maintaining and debugging problems as we go forward. One of them is the Python shell, the Django Python shell. So we do manage.py and then shell. When we do this, we're inside of a Python shell, but it is inside of our own project. And so we can do things like import from our polls models the different classes that were there. And that worked without problem. And in the shell, you get access to some of these commands like questions.objects.all. Right now, this is empty, but what it's going to return is the complete questions table where each row or each instance or each record, however you want to think of it, is its own item in this query set that's very much like a list. For the sake of demonstration and to match sort of what the documentation says on the site, we can also import Django utils select time zone, and then we can go ahead and start writing code as we would write in our Django app, but here, and it should work the same way. This is a good way of testing out functionality in a dev site before you actually start writing files, really isolate the logic you're trying to get to very easily. Also, if you're maintaining a database that has a lot of problematic data, sometimes this shell can be a very good way of trying to get to that data using programming logic that isn't as easy to use in SQL, at least for some people. I'm sure there's some people with SQL who can do it as well as anyone can with any programming language, but that's not me. That's probably not you. So here we go. We can have a variable called Q. It is equal to our object class question, and we can define the variables inside of it as we laid out in the models.py itself. And there we go. We now have this variable Q. There it says it's a question. Here we can do type class polls.models.question. This is all pretty obvious. One of the things that it gets because it inherits from the model is a function called save. And what this does is it writes something to the database. So anything that we have changed so far about this is now written to the database. So we can go way back up to the questions object all, and now there is a query set of object one, and that first one will be, well, the first one would be, the only one there would actually be the same as Q. I don't hopefully need to show off that. I don't know how I can show that off without it being super obvious. But here we see the question text is defined as what's new. And we could also do the same thing with the pub date. We could do ID. The ID is 1. Again, we saw that it always increments up. So it starts at 1, and the next one will be 2 and 3, even though we didn't define it. Let's go ahead and do the pub date. There we go. It's a datetime.datetime object. Also, if you don't know, in the Python shell, tab completion does work, and when there's more than one option, it'll show you all of them. So here's a list of things we could be doing with this right off the bat. PK is just another way of saying ID. It's just a matter of preference, I guess. We haven't made any changes, so no reason to save yet. So let's go ahead and make a change so that we can save it and then see what happens. So if we do the question text, we can just give it something better than just what's up. And there we go. Obviously, if we try to look at the question date again, that's changed. And the database hasn't changed yet, and now it has. And there we go. If we do questions.all, let me not do that. Let me do question objects.all. Doing this right. And there we go. Again, we knew that there was already a question there. We saw that before. We can get out of the shell, simple, just Control D there. And then the other tool, the last tool I want to show off, is the DB shell. This is very helpful because it will look into your settings to figure out how to log into a database and use that to get you into the right database with the right credentials. Although maybe not exactly the right credentials depending on what you're trying to do, but it's just a nice little shortcut to know. Here we actually have a SQL database, and I am more familiar with MySQL or MariaDB to be more specific. But if we run .tables, it shows us all the tables. Here we see some of those other apps that we were talking about before. So the auth app, the Django admin app. But our app that we define is polls. And remember, we created 2 tables, choice and question. And this is how Django just does it. App, table, app, table. So I guess technically this is the table. So app model is the name of the table. Sorry for that confusion. We can then look at how these tables are defined. And since we only messed with polls question, we're just going to stay with that. Again, we see that same create table as we saw in the migration example that we got to be printed out, and how it's created. Showing create table is always a good thing to know in MariaDB. Similarly, .schema for SQLite. And then, we can run basic commands. And, we haven't been in this database. We haven't inserted anything ourselves, but Django handled that for us when we messed with the models. And here we actually see that the ID is 1. The string for the question text is the new one that we set up and saved. And this is the exact moment that we did it, because right now it is 12:10. And we actually created it 4 minutes ago at 18:06. Obviously, time zones are playing a part into this. We don't need to worry about time zones at this point. And so there we have a Django app. If you follow the instructions on the website for Django, you would go on to create a whole interface that you can interact with. But hopefully you understand now how we can write some code that will change values in the models and how that would be saved into the database. And we could do our logic that way. What exactly am I going to do with this Django app? Well, I'm going to try to create a very basic product that I can recreate in multiple different stacks. So it's not going to be anything amazing for Django itself. Instead, the idea is to show how this stack can be used to analyze data. I have a whole system for creating fake data. I'm still a little questioning exactly how I'm going to present the data to each one of these stacks. I'm thinking as a series of CSVs to see if the stack has a way of dealing with the CSVs, but I don't actually think that matters. What is really neat is that Django does allow you to have multiple database setups for the same site, depending on if it's a development site or in production site. You can have different settings. I need to see if there's ways that I can go in there and just have it set up to use different databases, so we can see if maybe different databases with the same information run differently with Django. And it'd be a neat way of trying out different combinations of Django plus different databases. I don't know. we'll see in the future. I do need to do this similar setup for a bunch of other stacks, and I'm not sure if I'm going to do all those in a row or if I'm going to do like Django setup and then do Django showing off the data. I do want to do a video of showing me creating the data just as a chance for people to give feedback on what they see, to maybe give me some better ideas on how I could do it in a better way. But whatever the case, the whole idea of this series, the long-term goal of the series, is to just show off different stacks and how they all do the same thing, but how they might do them differently and maybe what tools make certain things easier. I do have a history with Django. I've used it in professional settings for many years, and with that, I do have more familiarity with it, and so I'm already enjoying this a lot better than some other things I've been researching, but I'll try not to let that shade my judgment too much, or at least be more open with it. Also, since I am running a tmux session, you can actually see that I'm not recording this the day I'm posting it, so yay me. But it is because, again, there's a lot of stuff just going on in the personal lives. This things just come and go, and that's just how it is. Nothing urgent, nothing major, just letting you know. If you do have comments, though, I do try to respond. If they are questions or if they are very helpful, I will maybe respond. So please, if you have comments, questions, criticisms, drop them below. I do take them all very seriously. I have made many improvements to my channel thanks to the complaints of people in the comments. If you like what you saw, please like the video, subscribe for more content. Every week I release a long form video on the weekend, and I think it comes out on Mondays. And then I also release something that comes out on Thursdays, a short 5-minute video, though my last one was a little bit longer than 5 minutes, but I really try to keep it to 5 minutes. So if any of those sound good to you, check out my channel, subscribe, and thanks for watching.